Hello everybody, this is TipTop MTG here today with another Magic the Gathering Arena video. In today's video, I am going to be showing you how to build an Omnath Locus of Creation standard Brawl deck. I think that Brawl is really awesome, and a major part of that fun is choosing a commander and building around it. It's a singleton format, which means that you have to choose a lot more cards than a normal for the deck. Instead of just telling you what I built and showing you gameplay, in the spirit of Brawl, I'm going to start with a commander, tell you what works well with it, and then give you my list as an example. You can just copy my list, or you can use my recommendation. Or, I don't know, you can just ignore both if you really don't like my recommendations. This way, if you don't have the cards to make my exact deck, or just don't like a specific card, you can build the deck however you want based on some simple recommendations. Omnath is an awesome 4-color landfall-based commander that can draw you cards when it enters the battlefield, gain you life when your first land enters the battlefield, add 4 mana on your second land, and deal damage to players and planeswalkers on your third. Overall, this commander has a clear theme of using a landfall trigger, so you're going to want to dump lands onto the battlefield, have other landfall triggers, and things like that. Generally Omnath is going to want to abuse the landfall triggers, and it's not a super broad thing like Kenrith, who really can be built into lots of different ideas. There are lots of cards that work well with Omnath, so why don't we break it into a couple different categories. First, let's talk about cards with landfall that I think are worth it. I mean, there are lots of cards with landfall, and honestly, if you take any card in Omnath's colors and throw it in the deck and it has landfall, you're probably going to be fine. This list is just a couple of the cards with landfall that, I think are the most impactful. So we have things like Lotus Cobra, which will let you ramp and is currently the bane of standard in my opinion, but I think Lotus Cobra is a very great inclusion. Not only does it, with Omnath, then that means you're going to be getting extra land, extra mana, because Omnath already ramps you a bunch, but I think Lotus Cobra will help you also get out Omnath, for instance, because he is a 4-color commander, and right now we don't have things like Shocklands in standard, so it is useful for making sure you have all your right colors. Similarly, but another really powerful landfall trigger is Philath Retreat, which can give you extra creatures. It can do a lot of really interesting things, and it is super versatile. Depending on where you are in the game, it can do certain things versus, if you don't need those certain things, it can do other things. So just, again, very powerful. Being able to create creatures on the landfall trigger is just really good. Next we have Scoot Swarm. This one is definitely a fun one. It duplicates itself every time a land enters the battlefield, and since your entire deck is built around that, you can generally get this going pretty fast. I think any deck that uses landfall, Scoot Swarm can kind of scoot in there. And then we have Morag, Fury of Echoum, which, again, is just a really awesome landfall trigger, giving you extra combats, and that may not seem that impactful, but if you have things like an Uro out on the battlefield, extra combats can be devastating. You can swing with Uro, gain some life, get some cards, and then do that again. And obviously, if you play a land with Uro, it doesn't trigger Morag, but Morag just synergizes really well with the landfall theme and with creatures that have good attack triggers, like Uro, who is actually running the deck. And even if you don't have something like Uro on the field, just being able to attack with, say, Omnath 3 or 4 times is pretty insane. Next we have Philath World Sculptor. So this one is another legendary, and this one really rewards you for playing basic lands. So this one is one that I would say you might want to be a little iffy on this one, because depending on the amount of basic lands you play, this may not be that great. Now, we are in Brawl, which means you are going to be playing more basics than you probably should for a 4-color deck, because, well, you can only run 1 Fabled Passage, 1 Evolving Wild, which both give you basics, so those are good lands, but we'll talk about that later. One of each of the pathways, one of each of the temples, and then we also have the triomes. So, it's a little iffy. You really want to look at your basic land count, because it creates a number of plants equal to your basic land count, but if you are not running that many basics, you may want to avoid this card. But it also, by the way, will boost up plants when the land enters the battlefield, so that's pretty good. Then we have Valikute Exploration. This one's an awesome card draw card, and I'll talk about it a little bit more when we get to the card draw section, but it is both card draw and a way to win the game. Generally, play a land or draw a card is pretty good, and it is in red, and it's actually pretty cheap, so pretty good. Next, we have Kazandu Mammoth and Kazandu Valley. This is a modal double face card. The card on the front has landfall, and it's a very basic, like, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn, but what's so great about it is that if you need things that benefit off of landfall triggers, say you're drawing a bunch of lands and not many landfall triggers, it's a landfall trigger. If you have enough landfall triggers and you're just not drawing the land to trigger it, it is also a land. So this card is super versatile and works well in a lot of different landfall decks. And then generally, like I said before, any card with landfall is going to work fine. You know, the 1-cost Red Hound 0/1 that gets +2/+2 every time a land enters the battlefield, that one worked perfectly fine in the deck. These are just the, I would say, most powerful of the landfall cards. But, you know, you probably could have just typed landfall in yourself. What are some cards that really help you abuse landfall? These ones are not as easy to find, but we have things like Ayesha, Soul of the Wild, which is going to turn all of your creatures into lands, and what this will do is anytime you're playing a creature, it will give you a landfall trigger. On top of that, if you decide to put that in the deck, I'm not saying you should, but if you do, then you can kind of at your end step always get a free kind of landfall trigger. It definitely just increases your mana, it's going to increase your landfall triggers, and it is going to be pretty good. On top of that, because you are getting out so many lands, Ayesha is going to be a pretty big threat itself, so it's basically a must remove for your opponent, which means that you may be able to they may leave your Omnath alone. Then we have Ancient Green Warden. This one's going to let you play lands from your graveyard, so if you have things like Evolving Wilds and Fabled Passage, you can keep playing them to get out all your basics. It's also just really good because you may run things in here that make you sack your land, or, you know, something along those lines, like maybe a Field of Ruin, which is going to kind of, it's similar to similar to Fabled Passage, where you're gonna kind of search your library for a basic, but you're also destroying your opponent's land and making them search, but you can keep bringing those back, but he will also double all your landfall triggers, so yeah, that's pretty good. We have Marasa Root Grazer and Nahiri's Lithoforming. Both of these are just good, you know, cards. Marasa's Root Grazer lets you kind of bounce lands, then replay them. So even if you, say, run out of basics in your deck, you can keep getting your landfall triggers. And Nahiri's Lithoforming lets you kind of say, hey, I have too many lands. I don't need to do this. I can trade them in for cards and then get some extra landfall triggers. I don't know if I would definitely sack all of my lands, but you could say, like, pay, 5 mana, sack 3 lands, draw 3 cards, maybe play a land back, get a bunch of landfall triggers. See, that doesn't sound that bad, so I definitely really like the card. We have things like Azusa Lost But Seeking, who is going to give you 2 extra lands per turn, which works really well with Omnath, who rewards you for playing up to 3 lands each turn, so being able to play 3 lands just naturally is pretty awesome. Radha, Heart of Keld, works really well with Azusa if you have both of them on the field, because Radha lets you play lands from the top of your library. On top of that, she also has an ability that lets you kind of boost her up based on the number of lands you control, which means since you are getting out all these lands, it's another way you can win. Then we have things like Cultivate, which are very obviously going to abuse landfall triggers. It's not only going to get you a land to your hand, but it's also going to throw one on the battlefield. So if you cast Cultivate on a turn, you pretty much guaranteed get 2 landfall triggers, which is kind of the minimum you want to get. Omnath's, I would say, most powerful ability is his adding mana ability, and so if you can guarantee trigger that, you know, you're paying 3 mana to add 4 mana and ramp and put a card in your hand, pretty good. We have Escape to the Wilds and Beanstalk Giant, both of which, you know, good ramp cards that are going to get you more lands onto the battlefield. Escape to the Wild is also going to draw you some cards. Beanstalk Giant here is just going to, you know, give you a land into play that comes in untapped, by the way, and then later on it can become a big threat, similar to Ayesha, where it's equal to the number of lands you control. Then we have Uro, Titan of Nature's Banning. Sorry, I meant Nature's Wrath. And he is definitely going to be in this deck. He draws you cards, gains you life, and most importantly, ramps you. He also then can come back and be a creature, and then he can repeatedly do that. And if you can repeatedly throw more lands onto the battlefield, that's great for Omnath. Similarly, we have Dryad of the Ilsen Grove. He's going to let you play multiple lands per turn and guarantee your color fixing, so that's really awesome. We have Migration Path, which is it's similar to Cultivate, but both lands go straight onto the battlefield, which means you could theoretically hit all 3 of Omnath's triggers, so that's a nice little way to do that. Migratory Great Horn is very interesting in the fact that it lets you ramp by mutating onto a creature, so for instance, you can throw this on, say, your Scute Swarm, and then now you're duplicating 3/4s instead of 1/1s. We have a Cleansing Wildfire, which lets you destroy someone's land, and then they search their library for a basic. And what this allows you to do is, say your opponent's playing a really scary land, you can blow it up and they'll replace it. But say you need a landfall trigger, you can cast it on one of your own lands. Or say you need color fixing or any of that, you can just cast it on your own land. And so I think that because of that, this card is super versatile and it works well. It's a hate card if it needs to be. It's also a landfall card. We also have Scale the Heights, which is very similar to Explore in terms of function, not power level, but this will let you boost up your creatures, gain you some life, and put lands onto the battlefield. Very similar to like Uro in a sense, but yeah, again, just throwing lands on the battlefield. And then in terms of lands you want to run, there are things like Evolving Wilds, Fabled Passage, and Field of Ruin, which I did all mention earlier, but they all essentially allow you to sack them to, bring a basic land from your deck onto the battlefield. And then generally, you're going to want most modal double-face cards. It's just nice to be able to have a card that's useful to you and then also have it be a land. And then most land ramp spells, so if I missed one like Roiling Regrowth, that's also good. It puts a land in your graveyard, which means if you have something like Ancient Green Warden, you can get that land back. Then things to spend your mana on. This deck is very much, I'm going to get a lot of mana really fast, and you want something you can kind of do with that. So one of my favorite examples is Stonecoil Serpent. I love this card because it is almost always useful. Even turn 2 as a 2/2, it can be useful against aggressive decks. Or you can wait until you have tons and tons and tons of mana and play this thing for like a 22/22. It has reach, which is nice against flyers. It does lots of awesome things, and so I like it. Similarly, we have Shatterskull Smashing, which has the advantage of being a modal double-face card, but it also is a win con in the fact that you can kind of just pay X and deal X damage. And if it's big enough, you get to deal more damage. Overall, just a nice little game winner there. We have Volcanic Geyser, very similar. You're going to do X damage to things. Ugin the Spirit Dragon is just a nice big threat that can kind of wipe the board if you need. It can be just a threat. It can go and you can put 7 permanents from your hand onto the battlefield if you manage to ult him, which could be 7 lands, could be 7 landfall triggers. Very good. And then we want generally the ultimatums. Those are also really good in terms of just, you're creating lots of mana, you're going to want to cast them. Generally, any expensive but good spell is going to be good. And anything that you can dump your mana into will also be good. If you have something that, makes it so that you add, you can put counters on your creatures for mana. It's good because you're going to be generating lots of mana. You may have excess. Put it into that. Next, let's talk about card draw. So generally, I talk about card draw and ramp. I'm not going to talk about ramp today because that's the entire point of the deck. Obviously, I've been talking about ramp for a while now. But card draw, we have things like Valikute Exploration, which I talked about earlier, but I think it's a really awesome card. It is card draw, and if you don't need the cards, you can just deal damage to your opponent. Shatterskull Smashing. Parcel Beast is kind of a mana dump, but it also lets you kind of ramp or just throw land straight onto the battle. You can either throw land straight onto the battlefield or draw cards, so that's awesome, and it gives you something to spend your mana on. Escape to the Wild is both a ramp card and a pretty good draw card. Scale the Heights, again, lets you draw cards and ramp. Uro is very similar to that. We have Once Upon a Time, which, allows you to go and get maybe those special lands from the top of your library. I think generally most green decks that either care about creatures or lands can benefit from running Once Upon a Time. And then the cycle lands are also really good. If, for instance, you don't need landfall triggers or you don't have any landfall triggers, you can cycle them away and hope to get landfall trigger cards. And then in terms of utility lands, there's really only a couple, but Crawling Barrens is pretty good. It serves that function of a mana dump. It also serves the function of being a land and, being a landfall trigger. And then we also have the castles, which I think generally are okay. They just have a little bit of extra utility. Now, because you are in a 4-color deck, it is, maybe you only do the green one, for instance, because you have the most green lands, but it's definitely a choice. Those two are pretty much the only utility lands I would really consider adding outside of something like Field of the Dead, or not Field of the Dead, Field of Ruin, sorry. And yeah, so generally, there are a couple other things. It's not just cards that I want to talk about. I also want to talk about the amount of lands you put in the deck. Obviously, you're going to want to put more lands than usual. First off, you're running lots of expensive cards. Second off, you are running landfall, so you want to be able to make sure that you are getting those lands, and that is really, really, really important. Of course, in terms of removal, For the deck, you can do generally a lot. You are in 4 out of the 5 colors. Of course, you are missing black, which is a very big removable color, but white has board wipes, white has universal exilers. It's just, generally, you're going to want white removal. Yeah, so you can build your deck however you want. However, these are just some cards that have a decent amount of synergy with the commander. Of course, add any card you like. Add more removal. Add some sort of counter manipulation. Also, if I missed awesome cards that Omnath synergizes with, let me know in the comments down below. Why would you add counter manipulation? There aren't that many counters in the deck. But you can do whatever you want. That's what's so fun about Brawl. Maybe you do take Omnath in a completely different direction. Anyway, moving on, here, my deck list is in the comments, or in the description down below. You guys should check it out if you want some inspiration as to how I built it. It's not perfect, but I enjoy playing it, and that's what's truly important. Overall, I think Omnath is going to be a very powerful commander, and I do want to warn you, if you do play Omnath, you will be matched up against a lot of the better commanders. So if you're tired of seeing your Garuks, your Kinnons, your all of that, I would maybe stay away from this deck, but otherwise, it's a pretty fun one to play. If you guys enjoyed this video and found it useful, please hit that like button, and if you want to see more awesome content like this, hit the subscribe button as well. I will see you guys in the next one.